I will again deny it. If you wish to file anything, Mr. Lewin, if you find it necessary, of course you may.
Thank you, Your Honor. We'll go with the court's rulings together.
As far as the order shortening time, thank you for doing that. That really refers to the pretrial motions. I know you did that in an abundance of caution because an earlier motion lacked a motion to shorten time. That would no longer be necessary.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor.
I also wanted to clarify with counsel that CalCrim 106 jurors asking questions, I would read that to the jurors after and the jurors are all here, you can get them after the opening statements and before the jurors.
Fixed. So what you're going to see now is a computer animation. First, Mr. Lewin showed you. I'm going to narrate it as to what the evidence would show. Bob comes, he sees Morris as he is suspected because he heard the TV. So he goes directly to where, well, I'm sorry, one of the technicalities has not been fixed. This is not, this screen. We're going to have to do it again. Why is that?
Just got to turn it on.
Can we start it over? So the jurors were confused about where it was.
It's on. Yeah, it was off. Yeah.
Just have to turn the TV on.
Okay, starting from the beginning. Bob hears a television. He opens the door, he sees Morris. He suspects that Morris has gotten the gun. Don't tell me. I'm sorry, I'm pointing over here and you should be looking here, I guess. But whatever.
It should be Woody.
Well, it was playing on that one.
That was your chance.
You need to turn this one off and maybe it'll play on one. No, they got it.
There he goes. All right. So he sees Bob. He sees Morris. Morris sitting at the table. He goes directly to the oven where he had it hidden. It's not there. And he turns around and starts toward Morris. Where's the gun? Morris comes up with the gun. He points it and they fall. And if you see, Bob had his hand on Morris's hand, which had the gun in his hand. Morris had his finger on the trigger. Now, you see where the blood spatter comes up and it hits the wall. The next part of the animation shows a diagram of the blood spatter. That diagram is in an oval, and that becomes important because the way the blood spatter hit the wall was not directly perpendicular to the flow of the blood spatter. When you dissect a cone without going straight across it, it describes an oval, not a circle. Okay. Now, the people's blood expert is going to disagree with this. We understand that, but we think the evidence is convincing, and the evidence will show that that's the way it happened. All right. Now, there's a person's ringtone tells a lot about that person. Okay. I'm glad that didn't happen to me. I checked mine.
It was ringing earlier. So.
It was on sound. At any rate, okay, let's talk about the dismemberment. The elephant in the room. Morris Black is laying, dying, if not already dead, on the floor. Bob jumps up. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't have a phone in the apartment. He left his phone in his car back at the synagogue. So he runs out the street to call 911. He runs down about a half a block away to Charlie's hamburger stand, and there's a payphone there. You don't see payphones anymore, but there was a payphone there then. And there was a woman on the phone. She wouldn't get off the phone. He then ran to a next door neighbor and pounded on the door. Nobody came to the door. He pounded on another door. Nobody came to the door. So he runs back into the apartment, and there's Morris, dead. No question. blood around his head, not moving. And Bob, remember, he's going to testify, sits down on the bed and puts his face in his hand. He didn't know how long he sat there. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. He didn't know what to do. He went to a nearby liquor store and he bought a bottle of Jack Daniels. He went walking on the seawall with his weed, smoking weed, drinking whiskey, trying to figure out what to do. He wanted to just run away, but here was his dilemma. He had rented this cheap apartment in the name of a woman dressed like a mute woman, and he was on the lam, even though there was no one chasing him, from New York, where Janine Pirro had opened her new investigation. There had been brutal stories in the New York tabloid. There was a dead man on the floor of his apartment. And that man had been shot with his gun. And he decided that the police would never believe him. So he decided that he had to get rid of the body. And he tried to move the body, but the body was already in rigor mortis, it was stiff. He couldn't take it out of the apartment without being seen. He decided that he had to dismember the body. Bob doesn't make good decisions. It's terrible. And so there's a hardware store not far by, a couple of blocks away, called Chalmers. It's one of these old style hardware stores. It's not like a big chain hardware store. And he's known there. And he goes in and he buys a knife and a drop cloth and some trash bags. And he comes back and he gets a tool from Morris's apartment, and he goes about the grisly work of dismembering Morris Black's body. You're going to see pictures. They're going to be worse than that one that Mr. Lewin left on the screen yesterday afternoon. And so you're going to have to see them. One thing when you're looking at them, if you can, and I know it's that hard to look at, is they tell how amateurish the dismemberment was, because he cut across the bones. He sawed across the thigh bones and the arm bones, instead of cutting around the joints as you would if you were going to cut up a chicken to cook it, or if you have turkey for Thanksgiving and you carve that turkey, you always go around the joints. It was crazy. We're not saying he's insane. We never have said that. It was a brutal, awful, hours-long exercise, and then he bagged up the parts, along with tons of evidence that would lead the police directly back to him. And he looked for a place to throw the bags, and where he found a place was Galveston Bay. The pier that goes into Galveston Bay. Galveston Bay is huge. At some points it goes into Trinity Bay, and it's 30 to 40 miles wide as far as Santa Catalina. And the tides work there. But where he threw the bags was this pier, and he could look into the water and see that he couldn't see the bottom. So he figured, well, this is deep, the bags are going to either sink or they go out with the tide. But what he didn't realize is that the Galveston Bay water is like chocolate milk. It's murky, and the bay itself is 2 or 3 feet deep in most places. It goes out deeper, way out. And when the tide's out, it's like a mud flat. And the bag's floating. He left, he came back, and he saw that the bags were still out there floating. And again, he panicked. He went back to the apartment. He took out everything in the apartment and put it in trash bags and put it in the trash behind his apartment. He will describe and has described what happened during that time as being almost in a dissociative state. What the psychiatrists call a dissociative state. Like watching yourself doing something. And it's because it's so grisly and so horrible that you can't stand it. You have to have some kind of defense mechanism to go through something like that. And the bags that he put in the trash behind his house had even more evidence that would tie him to the killing of Morris Black. I believe you're going to hear, either by stipulation or by live evidence from the detectives from Galveston, who will testify that everything they needed to tie Bob Durst was in those bags, including Morris Black's eviction notice, including a receipt in Bob Durst's name from a nearby optometrist where he was to go pick up some glasses in about a week. And including the gun. The gun was there, and this is so telling. This is what the evidence is going to show. In those bags was the gun itself, which was registered to Bob, which he bought in Pasadena, Texas at a gun store in his name, and a single expended .22 cartridge. One shot. And 2 clips. The clip is the part that goes in the bottom of the gun and has a number of shells in it. One clip was filled to capacity, the other clip had 1 less shell. It's right there, it's all there. Unplanned. That's what we think the evidence will show to you. It was unplanned, it was spur of the moment. And again, he ran. He ran to New Orleans, and then he came back. He came back to pick up a $30 or $40 pair of glasses. Here's a guy that sometimes carries $500, $600 in his pocket. He came back to pick up a pair of glasses. Well, the police in the meantime had seen the receipt from the glasses in Bob Durst's name, and they went to the optometrist and said, if this guy shows up again, call us. And so Bob walks in, and the people see that it's him, and they go back in the back room and they call, and Bob is arrested. When he's arrested, they took those pictures of him. And the judge set a bond of $250,000. Sounds like it's a pretty high bond, but it's a bond. It's a bail bond. If he can post it, he can get out. So Cody Caslis, the detective who was the lead detective, sat him down, and Bob said he wanted to talk to a lawyer. But he sat him down and said, your bond has been set at $250,000. Do you have it? And Bob said, not on me. He made a call that night to his wife, Debbie Sheridan, in New York. The next morning, the bondsman received a wire for the bond, and he was released. Cody Caslis, they recorded all the calls in the jail. Cody Caslis got the recording, saw that he called this woman in New York, didn't know who it was, so he called a detective in New York, put it all together, found out that he was a suspect, and found out that Janine Pirro had an interest in him. In fact, 2 days later, when they set the case for the first appearance in court, and Bob was supposed to appear under the conditions of his bond, he didn't show up, of course. He was running. Janine Pirro flew all the way from New York with her retinue and showed up at the arraignment with TV cameras in tow. By this time, Bob had run. He was running. He had Morris Black's identification, his driver's license. He rented a cheap rent-a-wreck car and began an odyssey of a month and a half across the eastern part of the United States, and ended up near where he went to school, Lehigh, in Pennsylvania. And he was arrested again. Shoplifting a chicken salad sandwich with $400 in his pocket. He asked to get to his car. He'll tell you what he wanted to do was kill himself rather than be arrested. Police didn't let him get to his car. He had loaded guns in the car. You'll hear all that evidence. He had decided that he was going to kill himself, and he had talked to Debbie about it. He even had a plot to kill himself in Douglas's driveway. So he was returned to Texas, and he was put in jail. They may play some of the tapes that he of his recordings in the jail. I'm not sure. And we went to trial. And the jury in Texas knew everything. They knew all about how he had run, how he had cut up the body, how he had...
It's improper.
Yeah, I'll sustain the objection. You can talk about the evidence.
The evidence was presented to the jury in Texas.
Your Honor, Mr. DeGuerin has been warned numerous times about talking about what the jury did and what
Right,
they
okay,
found.
no, I don't need a talking objection. I understand your objection. And that is that, Mr. DeGuerin, you may speak about the evidence that was presented, but the fact that the defendant was acquitted based on self-defense. The rest is not going to be in evidence.
So, the jury found him not guilty. After that, he faced up to the fact that he had dismembered the body. He pled guilty to a charge that got him several years in prison. And later he pled guilty to having the gun in Pennsylvania, did some more time, and then he was released. And there it would have ended. He settled in Houston. He had also a home in Harlem, in New York. And it should have ended there, but it didn't. I want to talk now about the Jinx and Bob's life before that somehow, in some way, explains Bob's tendency to run in the face of problems. Bob was born into wealth and privilege. He didn't choose it, but he was. When he was 7 years old, his father brought him to the window of their home. His mother was on the roof in her nightgown.
Your Honor, this is irrelevant information.
Hey, Mr., we're going to present evidence of this at the trial, Mr. Karen.
I think the evidence will be that, Your Honor, and I believe that Mr. Lynn discussed this.
No.
Oh,
So his father brought him to the window, probably to discourage her from jumping if she jumped or whether she fell. But what we do know, what the facts are absolutely certain about, is that she fell off of the roof of their home and was killed. Bob was 7. His siblings were all much younger. And his troubles really started then. He started running away. He ran away from camp, he ran away from school, he ran away from home. Seymour, his father, became distant. He was raised by nannies. He blamed his father for his mother's death. He went on to high school, he graduated, went to college at Lehigh, got a degree, and then he came out to Los Angeles and went to UCLA. And that's where he met Susan Berman. He and Susan shared a similar background because her mother had committed suicide and her father had been a dynamic man. He was a member of the mafia that controlled Las Vegas at that time. Davy Berman. She idolized him. But she lost him too when she was young. So they really made a bond. They were not lovers. They were close friends, like brother and sister. And they remained that way throughout her life. They both moved on. Susan started writing for magazines, first in San Francisco. And she was a great writer, terrific writer. They had a sense of humor. She wrote an article for City Magazine, and I think it's been on the screen, City Magazine in San Francisco, that said, "Why can't I get laid in San Francisco?" She moved to New York, wrote a book that was a bestseller in New York. Meanwhile, Bob had moved to Vermont and opened up a natural food store, and he met and married and fell in love with Cathy. And they had a wonderful life together, away from the Durst organization, in a small town, in a natural food store. But Seymour demanded that he come back and get back with the family business, and he did, moved back to New York. Cathy went to first nursing school and then went to medical school. And they lived first in their home at South Salem in Westchester County, and then they got an apartment on East 86th Street. If you know anything about New York, it's on the east side. And then they got a place on Riverside Drive, which is on the west side, and kept the one on 86th Street because it was rent control. Now, Mr. Chesnoff is going to speak to you more about what the evidence shows about that, and about Cathy's medical school, and about what happened from that point on. I want to talk to you about Bob and Jarecki, and we use Jarecki as shorthand for Jarecki and his partner Smerling and the Hit the Ground Running movie production company that produced the movie, which Mr. Lewin says you'll see in its entirety. It's a made-up movie, and it's fiction, called All Good Things. All Good Things was the name of the health food store, the natural food store that they had together in Vermont. Bob heard that Douglas, his brother, who had taken over the Durst organization, was threatening to sue Jarecki over this movie because it portrayed Seymour Durst as a pretty bad guy. And so he heard that Douglas was going to sue Jarecki, and Bob figured, well, if Douglas doesn't like him, I'll like him. Anything that Douglas liked, Bob didn't like, and vice versa. And so he contacted Jarecki. Prosecutors already told you about how that's going to be evident. And then he sat down for interviews. A number of real news organizations had contacted him and wanted to do a story, wanted to interview him. He turned them all down for a movie producer, not a documentarian. And he trusted Jarecki to do a fair job of telling his story. Bob was, everywhere he went, people would look at him funny. And he heard the whispers, he saw the elbows, and he saw how he was treated. Not surprising, given the verdict in Galveston, but still, he wanted to explain himself, how he'd been under suspicion for, by then, 30 years. And so he did some interviews that were very ill-advised because they were designed to be edited to make him look terrible. And an editor can make Mother Teresa look better. An editor can turn night into day. And he didn't realize it. And that's what happened with the Jinx. And so, in early 2015, the Jinx started playing on Fox. 6 segments, drug out week by week, with each segment having a little teaser for the next segment, with ads on the network television about the upcoming thing. We're going to solve the mystery of the disappearance of Kathie Durst. We're going to solve the mystery of the murder of Susan Berman. And Bob began to realize that this wasn't what Jarecki had told him at all. This wasn't Bob being able to tell his story. This was an effort, as Bob saw it, and as he will tell you, to make him guilty again. To make him guilty in the eyes of the public. And so after the 5th segment, when it became painfully obvious, even to someone with Asperger's, of what was about to come in the 6th segment, Bob ran again, as he'd been doing all his life. He ran to New Orleans. He had a loaded gun with him. He planned to kill himself if he was about to be arrested. He didn't have the chance because he was arrested in the lobby of the JW Marriott, and the gun was in the room. So he's put in jail. He called his lawyers late that evening. He's put in the Orleans Parish Prison, a place that's worse than the LA County Jail. He'd been up all day and all night. He was put in a cold cell by himself, no clothes. And about 4 or 5 o'clock that morning, the prosecutor and several detectives took him out and put him in a warm room, gave him warm clothes and coffee, started talking to him. You're going to hear that interview. Hopefully you'll hear it all the way straight through, and the evidence will show that Bob was being cagey even then. He didn't want to go back to that cold cell. He wanted to stay out there where they gave him coffee and a blanket and treated him with respect. And he was interrogated. Mr. Lewin takes a position that the evidence will show that that was a confession. You'll have the opportunity to make your own mind up about whether that was a confession, and we believe the evidence will show it wasn't a confession at all. It was Bob trying to play them. By the way, the map to Cuba, as Mr. Lewin called it, the evidence will show was a road map of the southeastern United States. I think it was in Texaco or something like that road map. And by the way, Cuba's off in the lower right-hand corner. It's not a map to Cuba at all. Did he say to Jarecki or to someone, I don't recall, but the evidence will show, yeah, I'm going to go to Cuba. I think the judge will probably instruct you on how to consider flight as whether it shows consciousness of guilt. I think the judge will instruct you on how to consider all the other bad things that the prosecution will bring evidence about, and how to compartmentalize that and what issues it should go to. That's up to the judge to instruct you. And so you decide for yourself whether Bob confessed. So where does that leave us? On the screen is a picture that you've seen several times, and it's a picture of a happy Bob Durst and a happy Susan Berman and a happy Kathie Durst. And on the right side is a picture of Morris Black. The difference in those two cases, the evidence will show, is as different as those two pictures are. Morris Black died in a struggle over a gun, and the evidence is going to show you that. The evidence will establish that he was a mean and aggressive person of whom Bob had every justification to be reasonably in fear of when that struggle took place. And that's important on the issue of self-defense and on the issue of a struggle. When you're in fear of your life, you have a right to defend yourself. I think the judge will instruct you about that, and the evidence will show that that's really a natural human right. It's different in every state, but it's all the same. Self-defense is self-defense. What the evidence, again, will show you that there is no evidence to connect the death of Morris Black to the disappearance of Kathie Durst, and more importantly, to the only thing that you can decide in this case, whether Bob Durst is guilty of killing Susan Berman. And I'll end it the way I started. Bob Durst did not kill Susan Berman, and he doesn't know who did. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeGuerin. And now, Mr. Chesnoff, you may present your portion of the opening statement on behalf of the defendant.
Hi. I haven't had a chance to speak to you at all May it please the court, Your Honor. Colleagues, all of you, most importantly, Mr. Durst, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my name is David Chesnoff. I've been a lawyer for 40 years. Married to my wife Diana, who's present. Our wedding anniversary, 35 years, is in 5 days. She cares for our small ranch that we have. We have horses, birds, lots of trees, thanks to her. We have 8 dogs, mostly rescues. I also have a 28-year-old son, Max, who lives in the valley. He works on the administrative side of a recovery facility. You and I share a huge responsibility because we have Mr. Durst's life in our hands. Even after 40 years of practice, you get nervous before you stand up. You get butterflies, perspiring a little bit, I'm sure. But my nerves always settle down when I remember that we have the greatest vehicle for justice in the world. The United States has the greatest vehicle for justice in the world. That's the jury, who are sworn to uphold the U.S. Constitution, probably the most sacred document in the history of the free world, without question the greatest document for freedom. And that Constitution, which you all swore an oath to, mandates that until the people prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt with competent evidence, you must find a person, a fellow citizen accused, not guilty. Now, I usually don't read a lot when I do these because I have an outline, but considering the magnitude of the opening that we heard from the people and the amount of time that's transpired, I may be reading more than I normally do. As you heard from my colleague, Mr. DeGuerin, this is a case that takes place over decades. And I'm not going to argue the case. That's going to occur at the end of the case. Rather, I'm going to try to provide you with a real roadmap of what the evidence is that you're going to hear. It's important to remember that Bob is only charged with Susan Berman's murder. That's what you folks are deciding. You're not deciding whether or killed Morris Black. You're not deciding whether or not there's enough evidence to establish what Mr. Lewin said, which is that she was killed in the house that night. And we're going to address that because that's what he said. Your job is to determine, true to that Constitution, that there is proof beyond a reasonable doubt from real evidence that Bob is responsible for Susan's death. The evidence that will show, as we've already heard, that he was acquitted by a jury in the Morris Black case. A jury that was entrusted with the same oath that you are, and in spite of hearing about the dismemberment, which they did.
Your Honor, this is again improper.
Overall, it's, you may outline the constitutional duty without making an appeal to it.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes, go ahead.
In spite of the same dismemberment evidence that you will hear here, found him not guilty. We will believe the evidence will show that Morris Black was killed in self-defense, and that is not evidence in connection with Susan Berman's death. It's no evidence. I'm going to repeat this a lot. No evidence is evidence. If it's not there, you can consider it.
Your Honor, this is complete argument. There hasn't been one indication. It's an argument. It's closing.
I'll move on, Your Honor. The evidence will also show that after an exhaustive New York police investigation involving the New York Police Department and the State Police of New York, 2 of the most respected police agencies in the world, Bob Durst was never charged with any crime with respect to the disappearance of Kathie Durst. 2 of the most respected police agencies in the world. The evidence will show that since 1982, 38 years with multiple police agencies involved, he has never been accused by the authorities in New York for her disappearance to this very day. The evidence will show those investigators at one point in time were led by a very hard-charging prosecutor, Jean Pirro. You may know her from Fox News. She's no shrinking violet.
Never one time have they ever even brought Bob Durst into custody for purposes of the investigation of Mrs. Durst's disappearance. Hair, fiber, blood, nail scrapings, all the things that police investigators investigate in order to determine who committed a crime. You will not hear one piece of evidence that there is a single bit of forensic material either from the South Salem house or from Ms. Berman's house connecting Bob either to Kathy's disappearance or Ms. Berman's murder. The only issue is the note, which I will talk about later. The evidence will show, and again, there is no forensic evidence whatsoever linking Bob to Mrs. Durst's disappearance, or more importantly, Ms. Berman's murder. The only evidence is the note. A note written by Bob to direct the police to her body. The evidence will show in a case that the state says is premeditated, the guy who they're saying premeditated it decided, rather than just plotting, to give the police a note to find the body. No evidence of fingerprints in the house, blood, DNA, ballistics, no phone records to tie anything that they have alleged is this giant conspiracy that Mr. Durst was involved in. Nothing from either one of those homes. Can you imagine that? 2 houses, no forensic evidence. No evidence is evidence. It means it doesn't exist. Because you had police in LA. First you had Beverly Hills police, then you had LAPD, then you're going to hear about the FBI. Then in New York it's 2 police departments. Not a single police agency has found a single thing linking Mr. Durst to these offenses. This absence of evidence exists even though the police have had 38 years and 20 years, respectively, to connect something with physical evidence. Go back all the time. Cold cases. That's what cold cases are about. Finding new evidence. We believe that the absence of evidence is evidence of why Bob is not guilty. The evidence is going to show you that Bob loved and supported Susan Berman, emotionally and financially. And she loved him and he loved her. He gave her tens of thousands of dollars over time. The evidence will show they share a bond since their days together at UCLA. As Mr. De'Aaron told you, both their mothers committed suicide. They bonded. They were friends. She adored Bob. And that's what the evidence will show. They were the dearest of friends. There will not be any evidence that they ever even quarreled, that they ever had a fight. They've had 38 years to find a single person. You will not hear anybody ever say that she and Bob had a quarrel. I'm going to explain what we believe the evidence will show relating to the disappearance of Mrs. Durst and the death of Mrs. Berman. The evidence will show that this case is based on false memories, a profound misunderstanding of who Bob is, and a Hollywood production called the Jinx, which the evidence will show was not an independent, pure documentary, but an eventual collaboration between the man who made the movie, the district attorney, and LAPD. You will see evidence that we believe will show that the prosecutor, in his interviews, led the witnesses to conclusions, traveled to New Orleans himself to personally interrogate Bob in the middle of the night. As Mr. DeGuerin just told you, he's in a really tough jail. Mr. Durst will testify he was naked in his cell on a cold metal bunk when in the middle of the night he is taken out by 2 police officers from LA and Mr. Lewin. Now, Mr. Lewin may have had a legal right to do that, but that doesn't mean you cannot consider that the evidence will show that you had an elderly person who had just been arrested, he's awakened in the middle of the night, and he's taken into an interrogation room. That's what the evidence is going to show you. And then you're going to hear the consequence of that. You will see evidence that Mr. Jarecki and his staff filmed multiple takes along the way of the different interviews of Bob.
Bob's going to tell you how Mr. Jarecki suggested answers to him. And as you heard from Mr. Lewin, even tried to trap Bob. Here the prosecution's entire theory in this case is that in 1982, Susan Berman helped cover up the alleged murder of Mrs. Durst by Susan Berman, by Susan Berman posing as Cathy, and then Bob silenced her years later because she threatened him. The evidence will show you that this theory was spun from whole cloth. It began in part as a result of a fictional movie that Jarecki made, in which, in the fictional, I emphasize the word fictional movie, it was presented as one of the theories that Susan Berman had impersonated Cathy at some point. That's how it started. What did that morph into? It morphed into contesting whether a learned dean at a medical school, who for years and years maintained that he spoke to Kathie Durst after the night that Mr. Lewin has told you she was killed in the house, that morphed into it was Susan Berman calling and making believe she was Mrs. Durst. All from a movie. All from a movie. In the movie, which was not a documentary, Jarecki presented that somehow Susan impersonated Cathy. The evidence will even show that even after Mr. Jarecki got involved in this, he personally provided the LAPD with a PowerPoint to use in prosecuting Mr. Durst. They were working together. He provided the PowerPoint to Mr. Lewin and the prosecution team that was used to get approval for the case to be filed. So the Hollywood producer who made up this story about Susan Berman imitating Cathy is the one that's providing the Hollywood script for why we're here. The evidence will show at no time, this is so important. To quote Mr. Lewin, this is very important. At no time in all of the years since Cathy's disappearance did a single police officer ever interview her. Not one time did a police officer go to Susan and talk to her about any of these facts. One of the reasons is the only time it started coming up that Susan was somehow involved was after this fake movie was made. But even when that happened, not a single police officer ever interviewed Susan Berman to ask her anything at all about Cathy's disappearance. And we're talking years that they had to do it. That's part of the burden of proof. You got to go out, you got to do interviews, you got to get evidence. Zero, not one word from Susan Berman ever confirming this phony story that the evidence will show about her impersonating Cathy. And I'm going to talk to you a lot about Dr. Cooperman's testimony under oath previously, in which he said it was Kathie Durst who called him that morning.
No, that's a direct misstatement of the evidence.
This is what Mr. Chestnut says he will prove.
The prosecution is saying...
Just testified, said there was evidence put on the record, testimony by Dr. Cooperman.
We'll see.
Well, I thought it was in, I'm sorry, I thought it was in
Go ahead.
conditional exam, remember? The prosecution is saying that the evidence is that Susan was an accessory to murder. We are saying there's no real evidence to support that at all. Let's discuss the story of Bob's journey with Cathy. In the fall of '71, Bob met Kathie McCormack, who at the time was a dental hygienist. After falling in love, Bob invited Cathy to share his home in Vermont, where he had opened a health food store called All Good Things. Bob wanted a life in the country, as opposed to the fast lane in New York City. Bob was a product of the '60s, was kind of a counterculture person. Despite his family's large real estate business, Bob wanted a quiet life in Vermont. Bob's dad ultimately pressured him to move back to New York to work in the family real estate business. They got married on April 12, 1973, which was Bob's 30th birthday. They first lived in the cottage in South Salem, Westchester County. They also got an apartment on East 86th Street in Manhattan, and then they bought a 16-floor penthouse on Riverside Drive, which became their sole residence. The 86th Street apartment was envisioned kind of as a rental at that point in time for other people. When they moved back to New York with Bob's help, Kathie enrolled at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, New York. The Durst family were large benefactors of the school, and that may explain in part how she got into the school. Kathie and Bob enjoyed all the benefits of living in New York City. Restaurants, plays, museums, and a very vigorous and happy social life. They traveled around the world together on exotic vacations and were constant companions. However, along the way, there were serious bumps in the road, and there were acts of violence by Bob that no one excuses. They're unacceptable. Nobody approves of it, and it was a reality of their relationship. No one's running away from that. But the evidence will further show that Kathie began using cocaine, and she was drinking alcohol to excess. While Kathie got into med school, she had difficulties, particularly in her senior year, and had many absences. For example, in 1980, she was unable to attend a large part of a clerkship, and that's evidenced by records that we have from her school. The school was also, quote, disappointed in her lack of responsibility, end quote, in spite of repeated reminders. A letter from the assistant dean for the students, Dr. Jean Cook, states, "Dear Miss Durst, I understand from my office that things aren't going too smoothly for you right now. Would you like to talk to me? Do you think I can help?" The evidence will show that it was Dean Cook who Kathie Durst called on February 1, 1982, the day after Mr. Lewins has said that she was killed in the house, the day after. And the call was transferred to a Dean Cooperman. On March 10th, Mrs. Durst withdrew from her clerkship for personal reasons. There's another record. On July 14th, 1980...
Your Honor,
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with
that
the document.
Mrs. Durst withdrew after she, there's certain things I can say, Your Honor, come on.
You got a document that indicates withdrawal as of that date.
They withdrew her when
You
she
can
was
argue
dead.
it, you can cross-examine on that point, Mr. Lewin, that's fine, this is what Mr. Chesnoff believes the evidence will show. You may continue.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. On July 14, 1981, the Department of Radiology wrote Ms. Durst and informed her that because she never completed her clerkship, her evaluation remained, quote, deferred. The letter noted that the school called Kathie numerous times and wrote letters, and she did not respond. In 1982, Kathie again was unable to complete her clerkship due to an alleged illness in her family. You will hear evidence that Kathie had a history of calling out instead of attending school. For example, according to Dr. Kaufman, Kathie previously called in absent from school with, quote, absurd excuses. Those calls were made by her. The evidence will show that Kathie's drinking and drug use contributed to her doing poorly at school and may explain her disappearance. The bottom line is that evidence will show Kathie was all over the place and was living an unstable life, at times apart from Bob. The parties had consulted lawyers. They were trying to reach an amicable resolution, including perhaps staying together. Bob will tell you about that. Bob and Kathie were still spending time together and had a home and a cottage in South Salem, New York, where they would stay mostly on weekends, and they loved it. South Salem's about 56 miles north of New York City in Westchester County. It's right near the border of Connecticut. In the afternoon and early evening of January 31, 1982, the night before she's supposed to be at an important matter at school, Kathie Durst goes to a party by herself, without Bob, at her friend Bertie Najami's house. Kathie drove to the friend's home around 4 p.m. Bob and Kathie spoke on the phone several times, and she assured him that she would be back soon. Kathie was drinking a lot of alcohol and was doing coke at the party. Again, at that time, Kathie was attending medical school at the Albert Einstein School of Medicine. Kathie was supposed to start a medical clerkship for her senior year the next day. So on January 31st, 1982, the night before she's to start her senior clerkship, the undisputed evidence will be that she was at a party, not resting to go to school, but at a party, even though she was supposed to start a new rotation at medical school early morning. Bob, who isn't happy that Kathie is at the party, calls her multiple times and asks her to come home. At about 7:30 p.m., Kathie returned home to what I will call the South Salem house. When Mrs. Durst arrived back at the South Salem house that night, Bob could tell she had been drinking. They shared a sandwich together, but Kathie needed to go back to New York City because she had the rotation in the morning. Bob did not want her to drive, and will be explained, because he needed the car the next morning. He said he would take her to the train. Kathie insisted that she drive. An argument ensued, and Bob took the keys to the vehicle so she couldn't drive. They got into a brief shoving match, but eventually Kathie agreed to take the train. It should be noted that Bob had driven the car to South Salem, and it was the only car that they had there. At about 8:50 p.m., they left together. Bob drove her to the Katona train station. Remember, Kathie's clerkship was to start the next day. Bob dropped her off at the station, and she took the 9:15 p.m. train. Mrs. Durst was wearing a large beige tan coat at the time. Bob went back home to the South Salem home, and he went to sleep. You will hear evidence that Mrs. Durst was alive after January 31, 1982. On February 1st, 1982, between 9 and 11 a.m., Kathie spoke with the dean at the Albert Einstein School of Medicine, Albert Cooperman. Dr. Cooperman was a graduate of Cornell Medical School. He worked at NYU and CUNY. He worked for the Rockefeller Foundation. He worked on the development of medical schools around the world, and ultimately became the Dean of Educational Affairs at Albert Einstein. He was a brilliant and accomplished man who was at his full strength in 1982 when he remembered speaking to Kathie. In fact, you will hear testimony that Kathie actually called Assistant Dean of Students, Dr. Gene Cook's office, whose secretary transferred the call to Dean Cooperman. You will hear evidence that Cooperman was expecting the call and it was transferred to him. Kathie told Dean Cooperman she was suffering from gastrointestinal issues, headache, diarrhea, which we believe the evidence will show cocaine because of the use of laxatives to cut cocaine can cause, and a hangover. Was unable to attend school.
Do I need to object, Your Honor?
No, I misspoke about the hangover. I apologize. I withdraw that.
No, it was the expert testimony regarding cutting cocaine with laxatives.
Go
I
ahead.
don't know. You have evidence of that?
I take the fifth.
Okay, the objection's sustained. Disregard that, ladies and gentlemen. You may continue.
Plenty of time to identify her voice and that she was a medical student. He spoke to her. He was expecting the call. He recognized her voice, and he had a 5 to 6 minute conversation with her. 5 to 6 minutes is a long time. I mean, if I stood here for 5 or 6 minutes, you would recognize that the evidence would show that that's a long time. He said that 38 years ago to the police. He told that to the police that were investigating a missing student. An accomplished, brilliant doctor who's trying to help the police find out where Kathie Durst is, and he tells them he had this 5 to 6 minute conversation with her. She wasn't an unknown student. Also, since she had so many problems with school, she needed someone higher up to talk to as opposed to calling fellow students as suggested by the district attorney. There will be evidence that Kathie called in Friday before and pretended that she was sick. This was nothing new to Kathie. The evidence will also show that when Bob reported Kathie missing, He told the police, he told Detective Struck specifically to call Dr. Cook, not Cooperman. Why is this important? This was at a time after the prosecution alleged Susan posed as Cathy to call the school. The evidence will show that had Bob been in cahoots with Susan, he would have known she spoke to Cooperman, not to Dr. Cook, and he would have told Detective Struck to speak to Cooperman. But he didn't. He told Struck to speak to Cook because that's the person that was Cathy's contact person at the school. And as I told you, Cook's secretary transferred the call to Cooperman. Most significantly, with all the police activity surrounding this case, there are absolutely no records of any calls between Bob Durst and Susan Berman preceding the call to the dean. No phone records, no toll records, nothing. There will be no evidence at all to show that Susan Berman ever spoke to Bob Durst on the night of the 31st or the morning of February 1st. None. No evidence is evidence. DAs, LAPD have the resources to find phone records. There are none because the calls never occurred. Mr. Lewin proposed that the evidence will show that the secret Susan carried with her for 18 years was that she called the medical school posing as Cathy. The evidence will show it's nothing but a theory created out of whole cloth. Not only did Dean Cooperman report this call to police over 38 years ago, you will see and have a chance to review Dean Cooperman's recent testimony, which will be evidence at trial. Mr. Lewin said it was unusual for a student to call an administrator, but the evidence will show that Cooperman was expecting a call from Cathy. Question: you were actually expecting a call from Cathy that day, weren't you? Answer: yes. Question: sir, answer: yes. And the reason you were expecting a call is because of your knowledge that you got from Dr. Cook and your review of the records and so forth, that Dr. Cook was very concerned about Cathy missing classes. Answer: yes. And that he told you to be on the lookout for a call from her. Yes. And the way the call came in, as best you can figure out, is that it may have called, come to Dr. Cook's office. He was gone, wasn't he? Right. And then Dr. Cook's secretary switched it to your secretary. Right. Who gave the call to you? Right. I guess there must have been some problem with hearing when he was testifying. And so when Kathie Durst said, I'm Kathie Durst, and I can't make it today because I'm sick, whatever the exact words were, that wasn't out of the ordinary for you at all, was it? In that particular case, I was not surprised. Fine. And throughout the years since 1982, 35 years as of a week ago, you've always believed that it was Cathy, haven't you? Yes. So when Kathie Durst called you, or you believed it was Kathie Durst called you on February 1st, sometime between 9 and 11 a.m. in the morning, and she said you were sick, you were interviewed about that multiple times, weren't you? Yes. When you received the call that for 35 years you believed was from Kathie Durst, she told you that she was ill. Right. She described her symptoms. Right. She described her symptoms in a way that you believed at the time a medical student would describe her symptoms. Right. Not some writer from LA, but a medical student who grew up in New York and spoke like a New Yorker. Not a woman from California who doesn't speak like a New Yorker. She described gastrointestinal distress. Right. She described a headache. Right. She described diarrhea. She described diarrhea. Right. You will see evidence that Mr. DeGuerin had previously refreshed Dr. Cooperman's recollection as to a previous statement, where he said the voice on the phone was Kathie Durst. Accordingly, this was a very detailed call with specific information, and Dean Cooperman had no incentive to lie. He also previously stated that he believed the voice sounded like Cathy, and it was only until he was pressured to question his memory that he questioned himself. The evidence will show you who pressured him. However, his memory was fresh when he first reported it and repeated it for years and years. At some time in the case, later on in my discussion, I'm going to talk to you about suppressed memories and how people, when influenced by either media or people that are questioning them and grilling them, can change their real memory, which of course we all know is better at the time than it is 38 years later. Remember, this was a doctor who was 40 years younger than today, a brilliant doctor who was trying to help the police with accurate and truthful information. The evidence related to Cathy calling on the dean on February 1st is significant because it will show you that the entire case is premised on a false assumption and a false presentation. Not only is there evidence which completely belies the prosecution's case, but you will see they have no evidence as how this alleged murder of Kathie Durst ever occurred. In a day and age where there was very little use of cell phones, the evidence will show that Bob could not kill Cathy on that night and could not coordinate with Susan Berman to call her dean by the next morning, and they have no proof whatsoever he ever spoke to Susan Berman that night. No proof means no evidence, means reasonable doubt. Again, there will be no evidence that Susan Berman made this call.
That's not.
I apologize. I'll withdraw. Sorry, John. Again, there will be no evidence that Susan Berman made this call to Dean Cooperman. To the contrary, Dean Cooperman supports that it was Cathy that called. This is the entire premise of the prosecution, and you will see that the prosecution has no evidence to suggest Susan Berman made the call. As I will discuss later, the only thing the prosecution will try to present is a few witnesses who claim at some point in time that Susan said something to them about making a call to the dean. That happened years later from people who were dear friends of hers, who were all spoken to by the police when Susan was unfortunately killed, and no time at all ever told a single police officer what they, years later, I think it's like around 2013, 14, or 15, they never, ever, ever told the police any of this at the time. That has to do with the suppressed memory, where we're going to provide you with an expert who's going to explain to you how that can happen. You will see that it was only till recently that law enforcement and the prosecution tried to seed doubt in Dr. Cooperman and pressure him to change his story. Here's how Dr. Cooperman testified about that. And you've also got the idea the police were kind of trying to pressure you into saying that it wasn't her, right? I don't recall the pressure, but I think there was something about the conversation that indicated to me that that's what they were aiming at, that the police were trying to get you to change. If you call that pressure, yeah. Right, well, let's look at what you said. Question is asked. Police made a big deal. Mr. DeGuerin was questioning him. He says, you were asked because did you feel like you were being pressured? And your answer was yes. And he said, uh-huh. Back to the timeline of Cathy's disappearance. February 4, 1982, Bob began calling Cathy's friends and family because he was nervous he had not seen or heard from her. Now you got to remember, she's an independent woman, she's in school, they have their own place in New York, she has things to do, and to some degree there's some separation. So not hearing from her for a day or two is not unusual, the evidence will show. He asked his next door neighbor in South Salem, have you seen Cathy or heard from her? Because they were friends. On February 5, 1982, Bob personally reported his wife missing to the New York police, including Detective Struck. He went to the police station with his dog. Bob will tell you that in a big crowded place like New York City, missing person situations are often either met with the person will come home. It's not unusual for people to stay out. Detective Struck, I believe, will testify that sometimes when there's been a party having an affair, that it's not unusual that they may not be home. Very wealthy man did not come to the police station with a lawyer, did not send a lawyer. He came himself to report his wife missing and to find her. You will hear evidence that he went to see Detective Strzok in person, and he had a magazine with him. And the magazine's on the screen, and lo and behold, there's the president, President Trump, that's his dad, and there's Seymour Durst. He brings this magazine with him because he doesn't want this to be given short shrift. You're just another guy coming in reporting somebody missing. He wants that policeman to know that this woman, Mrs. Durst, is a member of a prominent New York family, and being missing could have all sorts of reasons. Kidnapping, someone that she was romantically involved with, but he wanted to impress upon the police department that this should be taken seriously. You will hear that Trooper Harney of the State Police, another professional agency, searched the South Salem home on February 6, 1982, and specifically indicated that no signs of, quote, foul play were found. So, common sense, police suspect husbands if someone's wife's missing. Bob gives them permission to come into the house, and they go through the house without a search warrant. Now, even in 1982, police collected fiber, blood, DNA, looked for evidence of a struggle, looked for evidence of the murder that Mr. Lewin insists occurred in that house, for purposes of bringing a charge or a case. This police officer from a respected police department said there were no signs of foul play. Now, even if they collected something back then and didn't connect it back then, over all of these years, 38 years, if there was one thing found in that house that suggested that Kathie Durst was murdered in that house, as Mr. Lewin has told you, we'd know about it. There'd be a test. There'd be evidence. No evidence is evidence. Note that Bob was cooperative, permitted the search of his house without a search warrant, openly spoke with Detective Strzok. They didn't recover a single piece of evidence, not a fingerprint, not a fiber, no blood, to suggest anything happened in the South Salem home regarding Kathie. Bob also permitted the police officers to search the Riverside apartment. Bob continued to live in the South Salem home for years after Kathie's disappearance. He wasn't running from the home where we're told this murder occurred. To the contrary, he was cooperating and organizing resources to locate her. Bob and his family offered rewards, including a $100,000 reward, and headlines were in newspaper. $100,000 in 1982. It's a lot of money now. It's a real lot of money then. The Durst family gave interviews to the newspapers to create public interest in the case. This is a very private family. This isn't good, obviously, for the real estate business, but they cooperated. They met with reporters. They got interviewed. They tried to draw attention, trying to find Kathie. They hired private detectives. The police conducted an investigation, and Bob was interviewed, as were people from Kathie's school and an apartment building, which I described. Again, Bob is not charged in the case with the death of Kathie. It's kind of like Galveston doesn't mean anything except when it's convenient. Now Kathie, where there's no evidence that she was killed in the place that they say she was killed, well, now we gotta remember that no one has ever been charged in her disappearance. Bob is presumed innocent, and this case is supposed to be about evidence, not the lack of evidence. The lack of evidence means there's no evidence. Now, Kathy was reported missing. Susan Berman, Bob's longtime best friend from college at UCLA, helped to be his spokesperson in the media. As you know, they shared a bond. They kind of both had quirky personalities. Susan was an accomplished writer and journalist. She wasn't afraid of the media and wasn't intimidated. She was a really early kind of feminist reporter, actually. So she wasn't afraid of the press. Bob, who Mr. Gagarin explained to you has a form of Asperger's or autism, couldn't deal with that. So his friend Susan helped him. It's not unusual. That's what the evidence will show. He doesn't communicate effectively, and the disappearance of his wife and all the attention was very upsetting to him for the same reasons it would be upsetting to any one of us. That Susan Berman wanted to help Bob during this hard time doesn't mean that she helped Bob cover up. It means she wanted to help Bob with the press, which is what she did. She was out there arranging interviews, talking points to the press, which is what a press person does. Importantly, in 1981, prior to Kathy's disappearance, Susan had also published her book, Easy Street, The True Story of a Mob Family. In fact, the evidence will show that the generous, not the cheap, the generous Bob Durst paid for a book party. As you will hear during the trial, witnesses will describe that Susan always liked to be the center of attention and could sometimes rub people the wrong way. She had weird quirks and fears. She didn't cross bridges on certain streets. She didn't eat at restaurants unless she was absolutely sure its ingredients wouldn't trigger one of her professed allergies. She was terrified of falling out of windows, and of heights in general. Her personality would result in conflicts throughout her life, including among family and friends, but not with Bob. Susan also enjoyed being dramatic and testing people's reactions. She was a unique personality, which explains why she and Bob were such good friends. You can't always explain or understand other people's relationships, but in this case, the evidence will show you why they cared about each other so much. Not because of some plot, but because of a relationship that developed when they were in college together and lasted until her unfortunate murder. So when Kathy disappeared and no one had answers, Susan was there for him as a friend to help him through the chaos, which was all the attention that was being paid to this.
It's a good time to take our break.
Yeah, thank you.
So it's a 15-minute break. I promise we're not going to talk about law. It'll be a real 15 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, do not converse among yourselves with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. We'll see you at 3:15. Back, ladies and gentlemen, the jurors and alternates are present in the trial of people versus Robert Durst. Mr. Durst is present, Mr. Chestnut, Mr. Gagarin, Mr. Lewis, Mr. Ray, and Mr. Wu, Mr. Bailey, and Mr. Henderson, Mr. Milius, Mr. Miata, and the detective all present. And I'm leaving people out, but the record reflects a counsel is present. That's what I need to do. And the defendant is present and the jurors. That's the important part. So, Mr. Chestnut, you may now conclude your opening statement.
Thank you very much. I'm sure everybody here will be happy to know the conclusion. A couple of things to correct. Mr. Lewin was kind enough to remind me that Dr. Cooperman is not a medical doctor, he's a PhD. He got his PhD at Cornell, Ivy League school. He's a medical administrator, so if I misspoke, I apologize. One thing I want to go back to is, I had this up about Kathy's record at school, and this document is dated March 10th, 1981, which is a full 10 months before Cathy disappears. And I want you to hear what it said. It said, Miss Durst has withdrawn from the surgery clerkship. I'm going to watch it here, it's easier. MHMC-NCB for personal reasons effective today. So if that's what the message I was trying to convey, and if I didn't convey it well, I wanted you to go back and see it. But it shows that she had a history of withdrawals. You're also going to hear evidence that during the late 1990s, several women in and around northern Westchester County were flagged down by a middle-aged man named Timothy Martin in a car. When the women approached, they would discover that Martin's pants were open, and he was subsequently convicted of public lewdness. Before his sentencing, Martin told the police he had something they might be interested in. Specifically, Martin said he knew where Kathie Durst was buried. This alleged tip turned out to be completely bogus, completely false, and this pervert was just trying to get out, going to jail. However, despite this bogus story, a young detective named Joe Passera, at the direction of Miss Pirro, decided to reopen the investigation. That's what spurred the reopening of the investigation. As a result, the evidence will show investigators did a detailed search of Truesdale Lake in South Salem. That's the lake that's by the house. Divers used metal detectors in a meticulous grid search, spending hours and hours searching the lake bottom. Divers removed clear plastic bags containing mud. Investigators also used search dogs and removed part of the bedroom wall from the South Salem home, as well as checked the hidden storage area in the house the owner, the new owner, didn't even know existed. Once again, go through the lake, they go through the house, they go in the secret room, they dig the ground out, they're looking for forensic evidence, and there's no forensic evidence found whatsoever suggesting that Mrs. Durst was killed in the house. Accordingly, based on Dr. Cooperman's conversation with Kathie Durst on February 1st, and the efforts of the New York City police, who interviewed people in New York City, again, there was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that she had been murdered in the house. After the evidence is presented, that alone should cause you to find Bob guilty, not guilty, because there's no basis or motive for him to have done anything with respect to Susan Berman. Now, the ultimate issue in this case is whether Bob is guilty of the murder of Susan Berman. I obviously need to highlight what we believe the evidence will show in regard to the death of Susan Berman. Yes, Bob found the body of Susan Berman on December 23, 2000, and he notified police of her body as he wrote what the prosecution calls the cadaver note. But he didn't murder Susan. Susan was most likely killed the morning of December 23, 2000. She was last seen alive on Friday evening, December 22nd. She'd gone to dinner and a movie with a friend, a fellow named Richard Markey. The movie ticket was found in her home. After the movie, she dropped Markey off at his house in West Los Angeles. Markey estimated that Susan, who was alone in her vehicle, drove away from his residence at approximately 10:30 p.m. On Saturday, December 23, 2000, at approximately 9 to 9:30, witness Marvin Carr, a neighbor who resides directly south of Susan's residence at 1521 Benedict Canyon Drive, observed two of Susan's dogs roaming in the front yard of the residence. The dogs had their leashes on, and he observed the identification tags on the dog to have the name Susan Berman. Witness Carr did not attempt to control the dogs or contact Susan at that time. Karp would later state that Susan would also be outside in her backyard with the dogs at various times. On Saturday, December 23, 2000, at approximately 11:30 hours, witness Sandra Garfield and John Power were at the residence when one of Berman's dogs walked in their front door. The dog's leash was on, and he observed the dog's identification tag listing its owner as Susan Berman, with her address and telephone number. Witnesses in Garfield and Power attempted to contact her by phone, and they left several messages for her. They also went to her house and left a note on the front door advising they had the dog. They have their leashes on. I know that there's going to be some testimony that she kept leashes on the dogs inside the house, but it is just as reasonable that Susan was outside the house with her dogs, walking them, when whoever shot her accosted her. Now, we heard that there's no signs of a struggle. The photos at the scene indicate that the phone in the room that Miss Berman's body was found was disconnected from the wall and off the hook. That's evidence of a struggle. Moreover, there were paint chips on the floor near the door of the room. Well, that's photos of the phone off the hook and unplugged. And you can see one of the evidence signs. You can also see that there were paint chips on the floor near the door of the room where her body was found, suggesting a struggle. The front door was closed but unlocked, and the back door was standing wide open. There were also evidence of marks on Susan's hands, which may be from fighting or defending herself. The coroner report notes that there are several minute, small purple contusions on the front of the left and right thighs and inner right knee. There is a faint reddish, probable contusion on the back of her hand. The evidence will show that there was no proper follow-up investigation with respect to the door being damaged, the phone being off the hook, or with respect to the contusions and bruises that Susan had. The evidence will show that the police investigation in January or February of 2001, right after Susan Berman's murder, didn't produce one piece of forensic evidence for you to consider. There are no fingerprints of Bob, no handprints of Bob, no DNA of Bob, no blood of Bob, no fiber of Bob, no gun was ever found tying Bob to the crime. There are no shoe prints in the house. There's blood, and you're going to see there's paw prints from the dogs, but there's no shoe prints. A shell casing was found at the scene. However, the shell casing does not have Bob's print on it and wasn't matched to Bob's 9mm, the 9mm you heard about from the prosecution. And so you know, I believe the police experts will tell us, 9mm are the second most common caliber gun in the world, except for .22. Also, we have heard about Bob traveling down from Northern California in his car. Eventually, the police found the car because they did the mileage calculation that we heard about. They didn't find a single piece of forensic evidence in his car tying him to the murder. Nothing. As of January 12, 2001, a criminalist hadn't even been assigned by LAPD to this case. So if she's murdered on the 23rd, 19 days go by before the LAPD thinks it's worthwhile to go in with a criminalist and has signed a criminalist to study who might have killed Susan Berman. 19 days. No fingernail scrapings were done on Susan to identify a possible attacker. That's a common investigative technique. Skin scratchings can go under a nail. The police, years later, in 2013, trying to save face, and considered exhuming Susan's body to see if they could find it. They were told not to perform the test. The only way you would know if there was evidence of an attacker would be to do the test. No evidence is evidence. No evidence is evidence. We also know that because they delayed so long in actually assigning somebody to investigate this, that people were traipsing through the crime scene. Her relatives came in the house. Her manager, a fellow named Niall Brenner, actually climbed in the window of the house while there was still indications that it was a crime scene, went through her voicemails, which is interesting. We don't know if he erased them, didn't erase them.
Your Honor, that's improper.
Thank you, Your Honor. He actually went into the crime scene because it was never secured by LAPD, never secured, so that a proper investigation of who killed Susan Berman could be done. He went through her mail. This is, the police hadn't gone through her mail. And this guy was going through her mail after she was murdered, and the police apparently didn't secure the scene. A man actually went into the murder scene house and nobody was there to stop him. And he snuck in, by the way. He didn't have permission. He climbed in through a window. Accordingly, the investigation in this case was sloppy, it was incomplete, and no efforts were made at the time to find the real killer. So what's Bob's involvement regarding Susan at this time? The evidence will show that Bob traveled to San Francisco on the 19th. He then went to Eureka, where he picked up his car, a Ford Explorer. He drove to Southern California, stopping along the way several times. He made it to Bakersfield on the evening of December 22nd, but was suffering from migraine headaches and neck pain, and he'll tell you about that. He pulled into a motel and spent the night. He called Susan to tell her he would see her the next day and would pick her up for breakfast at the Rose Cafe in Venice. On the morning of the 23rd, Bob drove from Bakersfield to LA and to Susan's house, arriving in the morning. Susan was expecting him for the holidays, and many people close to Susan were aware of this, including her cousin Davy Berman and friend Al Clethen. Al Clethen is the fellow that His Honor mentioned would have been an entertaining live witness, but we have him on film. You will hear from Al Clethen at trial by video. The evidence will show that he met Susan in California. He was a performer and a writer. They became very close friends. They spoke 4 to 5 times a week. He even visited Susan's home on regular occasions. You will hear that Susan made him aware of Bob coming to town for the holidays. You will hear evidence that he was basically bragging about the fun he wanted to have with Bob when he visited for the holidays, because he was well aware of Bob's generosity. He testified. The last area, and this is a question for me actually, the last area I want to cover with you, I want to go back to this conversation you had with Susan where she said that Bobby was coming down and you guys were all going to go out. The court's, His Honor says to him, is that a yes? He says yes. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it wasn't actually me, it was Mr. Bailiff who was asking these questions.
Sounded like you.
When was this conversation in relation to her death? Not long before. Okay, and what exactly did she say? She said Bobby was coming. Bobby, it's going to be a lot of fun. He's going to take us all out to dinner. We're going to have a big party, you know, with some of our other friends, this producer guy that I don't even know his name. And it was going to be fun. Bobby is going to take care of everything. And did she say he was coming to Los Angeles? Yes. Did she say when he was coming? Around the holidays, during the holidays. Okay, and by the holidays, what months are we referring to as the holidays? Christmas. Just once again, because I kind of interrupted you, when you say the holidays, are you referring to Christmas? Yes, Christmas. And you're saying you had this discussion approximately how long before the holidays? When do you estimate? Not more than a week, a few days. How certain are you as you sit here today that Susan Berman told you that her friend Bobby was coming down to Los Angeles around the holidays? I've never been more certain about anything in my life. He was supposed to come 100%. Is there a particular reason that this conversation sticks out in your mind? Yes, because I was a starving artist, and I wanted, you know, I hadn't been having much fun lately. It would be good to get out. I'd become secluded in my little mountain home. You know, I just wanted to get out. I needed to blow off some steam on somebody else's check, basically. You were looking forward to being shown a good time. Basically, yes. When she was telling you that Mr. Durst was being a visitor for the holidays, she was excited about it, correct? Yes. Because she loved him, correct? Yes, yes. And this was at least maybe November, possibly December, just before her homicide, correct? I'm sorry, it was November or December, just before her homicide, correct? That she was talking to you about Mr. Durst. She, from the beginning, she would talk about him. In November and December, she talked to you about it as well, correct? Told you he was coming and you were all going to party, right? What date are you looking at? November and December of 2000, right? Yes, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. And she was happy that he was coming. She wasn't concerned that Bobby was coming. She wasn't, the evidence showed, blackmailing Bobby. She wasn't concerned that Bobby was angry at her. She was happy that Bobby was coming, because if you consider the evidence the way it's being presented, the idea is that somehow she was blackmailing Bob. Well, you're not happy if you think the guy who's coming, that you're blackmailing, is angry at you and he might shoot you. She wasn't afraid he was coming, correct? No. She wasn't expressing to you that she had been arguing with him or fighting with him about anything, was she? Not to my recollection. She told you, this is great, my best friend's coming and you're coming to love him, right? And these are on questions from the prosecution. They're not my questions. She didn't use those words. Well, is that the impression you got? You were looking forward to meeting him? Yes, of course. Okay, because he was going to show you a good time. And networking, possibly, is what Mr. Clefton responds. Okay, so you thought it would be your advantage to meet Mr. Durst. Of course. And that's because Susan had told you so many wonderful things about him, correct? Yes. Okay, never told you she didn't wish he wasn't coming, did she? No. She was anxious for him to be there with her. She seemed to be, yes, from my perception. You'll also hear from Clefton that Susan always spoke well of Bob. When did you first hear about Robert Durst? When she'd talk about her life when she was writing for Vanity Fair. And she spoke so highly of him. She loved him. She would always talk about her friend Bobby. She would call him Bobby. How often did she speak about Bobby? All the time. Because she would, you know, he was her best friend. All she talked about was Bobby, Bobby. And first, you know, I didn't know who he was. Let me ask you a question. Did she ever speak about any other friends other than Bobby? No. Only Bobby. Only Bobby. And what kind of things would she say about Bobby? What a nice guy he was. And how he was actually supposed to come to town around the holidays and take everybody to dinner. We were supposed to have a big party with me, her, and there was a friend of hers. We're all supposed to get together because, you know, we all wanted to go out. Nothing of truthful value to tell the police that would hurt him.
Sounds like argument again.
He wasn't afraid of it because she knew she was.
Sounds like more argument.
He testified to this, I presume.
Right. He wasn't afraid of it because he knew she wasn't involved in any kind of a cover-up. The prosecution is basically relying solely on witnesses who waited years to report alleged statements that Susan or Bob made. Actually, a lot of them was only until after they were aware of the Jinx and other media and were interviewed by Mr. Lewin, having reviewed media and heard third-party stories, that they described some of these alleged statements by Susan. They didn't do it in 2000. They didn't, I mean, at no time until it once again became a media sensation, and all of a sudden, all of these people that were supposedly great friends of Susan had these revelations. But never at one time did they ever share it with the police, when you would think the evidence would show a dear friend would tell the police whatever they could to help find who killed their friend. And the evidence will show they didn't. As you see, evidence will be presented which will support the suppressed memories can be altered. So, for example, even if those people aren't seeking attention or aren't making it up, they really, in their mind, think that something was said, we're going to bring you an expert witness, Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, distinguished professor at the University of California. She holds positions in the departments of psychological science and criminology. She's a professor of law. She has a faculty appointment in the Department of Cognitive Sciences and is a fellow of the Center for Neurology of Learning and Memory. Professor Loftus received her degree in math and psychology from UCLA and her PhD in psychology from Stanford. So, since then, she has published 23 books and 500 scientific articles. Her fourth book, Eyewitness Testimony, won a National Media Award. Professor Loftus has been an expert witness or consultant in hundreds of cases. Her research has focused on human memory, eyewitness testimony, and also on courtroom procedure. She's been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. She was elected president of the Association for Psychological Science, and I could go on. She's received numerous awards. She is prepared to testify at this trial about the workings of human memory, the effects of suggestion on memory, the mechanism of creating false memories, and the characteristics of false memories, and her review of materials in this case. Moreover, she would identify some of the suggestive activities that occurred in this case, such as leading questions when people are being interviewed, and outside research, including media, including the Jinx. She will testify at trial regarding her studies of human memory and how memories can be changed by things that people are told by other people. In other words, she's going to talk about how ideas and suggestions and other post-event information can modify people's memories and that people can get distorted memories of things that allegedly happened or even develop false memories. Memories can be contaminated with misinformation from leading questions, media reports, and other witnesses' false recollections. False memories can be expressed with a great deal of emotion and the belief that they're true. As time passes and memory is getting weaker and weaker, you become even more vulnerable to post-event information. There will be no physical evidence of anything happening to Mrs. Durst in the South Salem home. Dr. Cooperman received a call from Kathie Durst the day after the DA says she died in the house with no forensic evidence. An extensive police investigation over years never led to charges against Bob for Mrs. Durst's disappearance, let alone a prosecution and a trial. There is not one piece of scientific evidence whatsoever tying Bob to Kathie's disappearance or Ms. Berman's murder. The evidence refutes the argument that this was a premeditated crime. As he announced his visit, people were well aware he was coming. He gave her a large amount of money to help her, not because he was bribing her, and she wrote back to him with affection, with real affection, for thanking him for helping her when she was down and out. He cooperated with the police. He offered rewards. He hired detectives. He loved them both. The unfairness of all of this is after 40 years they never charged him with Kathie's disappearance, and yet he has to face that. He has to face a murder charge for a case that he was acquitted in. Mr. Durst will testify that it's the kind of things like that that make him believe that he is a pursued person. It's not paranoia. It's happening here. There were witnesses in New York who Detective Struck interviewed about whether Kathie was in New York City after that January 31st, 1982 night, that are now deceased and who are unavailable for trial. who were interviewed by Detective Strzok. He wanted to know if she was in New York, whether she had boyfriends, whether she used drugs. He and other policemen in New York acted on the information they got from those people, and as a result, 2 police agencies in New York and in Westchester both decided not to prosecute Bob Durst for Kathie's disappearance.
No, it's an argument, and it's also not factually correct, it's also.
Oh, okay.
Is that a
No.
speaking objection?
It is a speaking objection. Please don't make a speaking objection. I think that that's on this side of okay.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Which side, Mark?
It's okay, overruled. This side of okay. I understand your concern about that, but I think that it was stated
You're speaking objection.
appropriately.
He and the other policemen acted on their investigation in New York by not prosecuting Bob for Kathie's disappearance. There was no arrest, no trial. Mr. Lewin unequivocally stated she was killed in the South Salem house. Mr. Lewin is very bright, very skilled, but he isn't the judge. That's the judge. He's certainly not you, the jury. His opinion doesn't count. Your opinion counts. His arguments are not evidence. He cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mrs. Durst was killed there. He cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a jury of fellow American citizens in Texas found Bob not guilty. And he cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Bob shot Susan Berman. This case was wrapped in a bow by Jarecki and his Hollywood production. It led to a universal belief that Bob would never get a fair trial. But everybody over here knows that you people are going to consider evidence only. And if the evidence is not there, Bob Durst will be found not guilty, and he will leave the courtroom as innocent as he is as he sits there. Because remember, until you hear the last piece of evidence in this case, he is presumed innocent. And until you people collectively analyze that evidence and say, is there really proof, he stays innocent. And you will find him not guilty. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Chesnoff. So a couple of points. Mr. Bailey, and I know you've had the witnesses ready, and they're going to come tomorrow, or would you like to squeeze in a few minutes today?
They'll come tomorrow, unless you'd like to start with a video.
Eager as I am to begin the evidence, I think that we could all use a night's sleep before we process it. There was a question earlier about notes. About asking questions and about how you would present that by way of a note. Let me be very clear about the process. If during the trial you have a question that you believe should be asked of a witness, you may write out that question and send it to me through the bailiff. I will discuss the question with the attorneys and decide whether it may be asked. Do not feel slighted or disappointed if your question is not asked. Your question may not be asked for a variety of reasons, including the reason that the question may call for an answer that's inadmissible for legal reasons. Also, don't guess the reason your question was not asked or speculate about what the answer might have been. You're going to hear a lot of evidence, so I think if you're patient, your questions will probably be answered by the presentations of the lawyers. But always remember, you're not advocates for one side or the other in this case. You are the impartial judges of the facts. So keep that in mind before you write a question. So this concludes the opening statements. Now you're going to hear the evidence. We'll begin with the evidence tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So get a good night's sleep, and take care of yourself. Remember my instructions about washing your hands. And if you're ill, do call us and let us know. We don't want anyone else to become ill. I think we've got a pretty safe environment here. It's not a mass meeting, separated a little bit from each other, and I don't think we should be afraid of as long as we take sensible precautions to, good sensible precautions to protect our health. So with that, I'm going to give you the admonition. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 9.